right, this is Elizabeth Townsend. It is April 4th. This is our third interview of the day, and it's with Diane Dear for Dean Massara's project. Hi.
Hi.
Well, we're going to talk about lots of things. I thought maybe we'd start with some just basic questions. You had talked about wanting to discuss things about the comparison of what different things you've done, what they are, and sort of to give students and people a sense of what that is. So I thought we'd just start there.
Okay.
And we can start with, I guess, with the employment litigation, if that's what you'd like to do.
Great.
Okay.
Just by way of context, I graduated in 1987 after going to college, but then taking a few years off and going back to law school. And I always had an interest in employment in that area, discrimination, employment relationships. So it was kind of a natural draw to go into that. I started practice with a large firm in Phoenix that did employment defense work, and increasingly it became more litigation oriented, and that's what I did for about 10 years. Defended companies in wrongful termination lawsuits and discrimination charges, worked with the EEOC or against the EEOC as the case might be, and defended companies and supervisors sometimes, and did a lot of depositions, discovery work, interrogatories, motion practice. Employment practice, for the most part, employers wanted to avoid trial if at all possible, because there was a sense that if you got in front of a jury with an employment case, the jury, the comparison, that they would sympathize with the plaintiff. And I think the thinking on that was that when you're in any other kind of litigation, not everyone on the jury has necessarily had that experience, so perhaps they can be more objective. You know, not everyone has been subject to medical malpractice or hit and run or whatever it might be, whereas pretty much everybody's either worked or has an intimate relationship with someone who has worked. So I think the feelings of sympathy, the employers perceived anyway, were a bit stronger there. Nevertheless, I did do some trial work, did try a couple or 3 jury trials, and as I said, did that for quite a few years, and eventually got to the point, I'll let you explore that further if you want, but made the change to business immigration law, which I still work in terms of clients. It's very similar that I represent companies, and it has a lot of similarities in terms of personnel matters, employee relation types of issues, but no litigation whatsoever.
Why?
The thought I remember thinking, and then I'll go backwards, was if I have to spend another 10 years taking depositions, I'll scream. And I think the reason why is I found, let me just pause for a moment, I was thinking before this interview today, and I wanted to be fair to litigation. And then I thought, you know, you're probably going to talk to plenty of people who do litigation and who like it and do it well. So I thought, I think I'll just speak from my own experience, and you know, people can listen to all of it and sort of draw their conclusions. My experience was it ended up a lot of arguing about things that ultimately didn't matter. The few times I went to trial, the trial experience actually I enjoyed a lot, because you were really telling a story, you were explaining something to people. In large part, you were almost educating people, and you know what they were going to decide, what they were going to decide. The discovery leading up to that I found very unpleasant. Again, I think a lot of arguing. I mean, I remember things like, well, why didn't you produce this piece of paper 2 weeks ago? Well, you know, maybe my client just found it, or you know, maybe your interrogatory wasn't clear. I mean, just a tremendous amount of back and forth about those sorts of things. I was trying to think about, you know, why that might be, and I have a couple of opinions. One is, I think the people that are probably not the best litigators, but a lot of people that are drawn to it have a lot of ego invested in it, and it's sort of about proving that your client's version of the truth is correct, and not necessarily about there's some truth out there that together we're going to figure out where it is or get to it, or through, you know, I think even in the best light of litigation you might have an idea that through this adversarial process you discover the truth. At least I think that's what I remember from law school. And instead, what I found was much more about, okay, here's what happened to my client, or what my client did, and my job is to prove that that was the right thing. I won't say at all costs, but at extreme costs, I found.
How do you deal with that?
Leave the practice? No. No, I mean, I found it very difficult. I found it very stressful. I think honestly, the way you deal with it, with that kind of lawyer on the other side anyway, is you have to be able to do that great deal of that yourself, and perhaps have to shift your ideas about the best way to go about things to the situation that's occurring, and say, okay, this is the way this is going, and I still have a duty to represent my client, and I certainly believe, that maybe they didn't do the perfect thing, but I don't believe the plaintiff's version of the story, and my client's going to be harmed if I just kind of lay down and let this bad guy roll over me. So I've got to kind of up my ante as well, and maybe be more aggressive, maybe utilize different strategies than I'm personally comfortable with.
And did you do that? I mean, did you find yourself doing things where, how do you rectify that when you don't feel comfortable doing something and you still...
You have conversations with yourself like, okay, I just need to learn a lot more. This is my issue. I need to change the way I look at things. This is sort of my weakness. For me, I never thought, I'm on the higher ground necessarily, or the right person. I was always very aware of, okay, this speaks to my weakness and my inability to be a little more hard-charging, or to take those things less personally.
I think it would be really hard to be in a situation where people are being mean to you all the time.
Yeah, it is. And, not always mean so much, but just a level of intensity in terms of, I don't know, maybe meanness is the right word. Not mean to you personally, but aggressive, I think is the word. Very aggressive all the time. And always about, sort of point, counterpoint, and never sort of conceding anything. Mm-hmm. And I think I found that difficult even with my own clients, of course, because what they want you to do is sort of defend them to the death. And so when you're in a situation where you're thinking, they kind of have a good point there, mm-hmm. And trying to educate your client that, this really is a weakness in our case, and this is something we're going to have to face up to. I think that's what good litigators do very, very well, and I think that may be something that either takes just the right personality or level of wisdom or years and years of practice, because the first thing that your client's going to do is, look at you and say, but you're supposed to be representing me. You're not pushy enough, you're not aggressive enough. What are you coming back and telling me you're taking their side of the story for? So.
Do you think that there's a place for a different, you talked about, you just had said that, but I was just thinking, can you fight that aggressiveness with alternatives, or is it just impossible?
I suppose theoretically it is, but day to day it's really hard. Mm-hmm. Let's say you get some outrageous demand letter, or a ridiculous set of interrogatories or something, and you pick up the phone and you call the other person and you say, what is this? Let's talk about this. And my experience was most of the time they're like, tough, answer them. You don't want to answer them, we'll go to the judge or something like that. So
that seems really hard. So how do you deal with all that negative energy coming at you? And does it affect your personal life or your health, or how do you? I think it'd be really hard not to take it personally.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think different levels for different people. In terms of taking it personally, another thing that goes with that, I think the reason, I think intellectually, let me kind of speak to the satisfactions of litigation for a minute, it's a great intellectual game. And I think to some extent, you try to encourage yourself, if it's not a natural sort of personality fit, you try to encourage yourself to get caught up in that intellectual gamemanship of it. And maybe, these people that I'm characterizing as mean and bad, maybe that's what they've done to even a greater degree. And I think you try to find some satisfaction in it. So you find those pockets of it that you think, okay, this was good, and I took the challenge here and did what I needed to do, or I outsmarted them, or something like that. And I think the people that do even better at it don't take it personally, either in terms of the pressures and the deadlines and all of that, but also really in terms of sort of either second guessing their decisions or having things not go the way you wanted or losing an argument. And I found that real difficult not to take personally, just because it felt like a measure of how well you were doing your job. And I think the best litigators that I've seen manage to be, almost like good doctors. The way that they're the best doctors are people. I was just talking to a guy this weekend, and somebody asked him, well, what was it like the first time you cut on somebody? He said, well, by the time you get to that point, you've kind of seen it and you've distanced yourself enough from it so that you can do a good job at it. And another analogy he used, which I think there's some crossover to practicing law, was he said, really by the time you cut the skin, every other part of the person's body is draped over, and you're just sort of looking at this little square, and so it's not like it's a person. And I think that's not a bad thing at all, but it takes the right person, or like I said, a lot of practice to be able to get to that point, I think.
And so what is business immigration law like in comparison
Oh,
to?
wonderful, heaven. For me, it is. It plays to my strengths, which are, it's not adversarial. There are areas of it that could be in terms of, suing the INS, but I've chosen not to even do that part of it. My job is basically to marshal facts, to multitask tremendously, which I think, compared to sitting down and writing a brief maybe, or the focus of taking a deposition, some people I'm sure would say, oh my God, that's just like, how do you do that many things at once and pay attention to that many little different pieces of things that aren't necessarily related? And to me, that comes very easily. I'm really good at sort of organizing everything that's going on around me and figuring out how to put it sort of into mental charts in terms of how to approach things. And I can do that in the work that I do now.
Can you give an example of that, what you're talking about? Or maybe you describe like a day of what your day is like.
Yeah, I'll describe the day, and then maybe the chart thing will come to me. I can be dealing with emails, just tons and tons of emails from 4 national employees who want to know everything from where I'm at in the process now, if I want to get married, will that hurt me, will that help me, will it cause delays, how do I get my spouse into the country, what do I do, to a call from a client saying, I want to hire this person, they don't have this degree, but we really need them, the manager says they want them now, how do I do that? To a client saying, we're going to lay off 1,000 people tomorrow, the Department of Labor is going to want to know what's happening, how do we orchestrate that so as not to impact the morale of the current foreign national population we have, and to keep their process going. And then that's kind of the legal part of it, and then part of the day might be drafting an application to get a particular company designation as a sponsor of a particular kind of visa where they can bring tons of people in to get training, to somebody else calling and saying, we've got a problem in Costa Rica, these managers are running haywire down there and not doing what we told them to do, and now the consulate won't issue visas, and you need to get on the phone with the consulate and talk to them and find out what happened and straighten that out. And to me, that's just a whole lot of fun.
That's a lot of stuff.
It's
It seems like there's lots of, are you dealing with the companies or the people, the individuals, or all of the above?
Both, which makes it a real interesting mix. I find it very stimulating and not draining, whereas, again, I think some people's personalities might be such that doing litigation is like really stimulating. And for me, yes, it was stimulating, but it was equally, if not far more, draining. So it was, what I do now, I think it's really fun for me.
How do you deal with all the different one of the things that comes up a lot in terms of issues that you're supposed to talk about is your clients may come from different cultural backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to understand what their needs are versus what you think they need.
Right.
Do you face that with all the different things that you're doing in terms of that? Does that come into play, or are the issues involved pretty clear cut in terms of that they want to stay here or they need something? Do you know what I mean?
Most of the time in the kind of work I do, they're pretty clear cut, although one aspect of it that I think is, law in some respects, at least the transactional law that I'm doing, is in many ways becoming more like a business where you're providing legal services. I mean, some of our clients refer to us as vendors, and we're an outside provider. And that's not a bad thing, again, because I think lawyers, I think particularly have had a history of, I know the law. It's sort of like us taking our car to the mechanic. You take care of it. And my client base is really far more educated about what they need and what they want from us than that. So with respect to the individual foreign-net, well, number one is we need to provide client service. We need to make people, our clients, the big companies, will do sort of customer satisfaction surveys with the foreign national employees. How did you like how that law firm provided the service to you? And so a lot of it has to do with, being friendly, being available, being thorough, being accessible, and some of that has to do with their culture, kind of learning what they expect from you, what they take as rudeness, what they do that you would normally in our culture consider rude, that you realize is not rude. But I think it's pretty universal, particularly for those people. What I've learned now is, of course, they're driven by anxiety. Each of us gets up every day and knows pretty much what we're going to do, and that we have a home, and that we're going to live here, and that, barring some catastrophe, we have a job. And these folks, it's all very tenuous, and, the economy goes south, or, they leave the country with the wrong visa, or, something like that, or they don't get married in time. The Indian arranged marriage is a really interesting thing, because a lot of that revolves around this, that they want to bring a spouse in. This is getting into the substance of it, but they need to get it, if they bring a spouse in and have the spouse obtain their permanent residence with the employee, they have to do that before their employment-based immigration is approved. Well, many times they don't know who their spouse is going to be. It's still a lot of arranged marriages, but it's very human. You could talk to them about that, and you kid them about it, and it's very cute. The flip side of that, I just had a case where a guy said something about, well, your paperwork's all filled out now, and we understand your wife is going to immigrate with you. And he said, well, actually, she's not here right now. She went back to India. And then he writes back a few days later and says, well, actually, I found out she didn't go back to India. She's living with her uncle. She's left me. It's very sad. But to get back to your question, I don't need to know that much about cultures, but just to be sensitive. And I think that's true of anything. I think you're doing litigation, you're doing any kind of law, I think that it's probably a mistake to assume too much. I think you always need to be pretty open to letting them tell you, where they're at, what their concerns are, and not just sort of driving forward yourself.
Do you think that law schools should play any kind of part in helping prepare students or young lawyers in that field, or do you think it just works out fine the way it's working now in terms of being sensitive to your clients' needs?
I think it would be a great idea to have like a residency, like doctors. To some extent you have that in your clerkship, if you clerk after your first or second year. But I think that's a little distorted because it's sort of a marketing, thing for the firm and for you, and everybody's just kind of, showing up and looking and smiling nice and hopefully doing a fair job on whatever written product they give you. But I think it would be a great idea to sort of require some period of residency almost, not as long as doctors, we'd never get around to making a living, but, maybe a year, and maybe in different areas that you wouldn't, again, I'm not that familiar with the medical profession, but I'm thinking, some sort of rotation, thing. And again, I know people try to do that through clerkships, but you get, 2 weeks in the banking department, and they take you to lunch every day, and then 2 weeks, watching a deposition. I mean, it's not quite the same as, being in the throes of something.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, this sort of leads into other questions on life philosophy, because you have been definitely talking about sort of what you recognized as what you wanted to do and what you didn't want to do. And I wanted to know if you had, well, first just a general life philosophy, but also sort of where law fits within your sort of thought, what you think about law and where it fits within your life.
I went into law because I love to think, and that's still the case. So I love the analytical process. I mean, that's my strongest way of dealing with the world, I think, and it works very well. So I don't think it's the only way, but it's certainly an expression of my talents. So, I mean, to that extent, just kind of practicing law for a living in general is, I think, real consistent with who I am and the way I deal with the world. I think I've listened to other people talk about why they went to law school, and it ranges from everything from I want to do good to I teach adjunct at ASU Law School, and I asked the students this question the first class of this semester, and one guy I remember just said, it's sort of interesting and it's a good way to make a living, and I'm not here to save the world or do anything particularly meaningful. I just and I don't see anything wrong with that. And I kind of thought, good for you. There is nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to be a lawyer. And it doesn't have to be about any particular one thing. I think, my advice would be, find out what it is for you and try to channel it that way.
How do students do that? How do young lawyers do that?
Experiment, trial and error, which brings up another point, I suppose. I don't know many people. I was a partner at a multinational law firm when I made the switch, and it was a huge decision, and I don't know that anyone there had done it before, frankly. I'm sure people do it in ways that are a little more subtle, or maybe just as bold, and I haven't known about it. Because I think people sometimes go from big firms to small firms or private practice or, to government work. But the thing I would say is don't be afraid to change. I mean, I think a lot of people get, locked into one thing, and you've got, student loans, and you've got this whole lifestyle, not just monetarily, but everything, even the litigation. I mean, I remember thinking, well, I've invested so much energy in trying to get myself to fit in this box. How can I just walk away from it now? What does that say about me? Am I giving up? Am I failing? Am I looking for something else just because I didn't do that well enough in my own eyes?
So how did you do it? How did you make the switch, and sort of your lessons from trying to go from one thing to another thing? This totally appears totally different.
I have to say, in large part, there's some very human elements to it. I first had explored going in-house and had talked to some people about that and was seriously considering that. And I talked to other people about working for the government. I thought about doing that, and just, I think for probably 6 months or a year, just kind of explored the whole thing, and ultimately made the decision to leave the firm I was with and went to one of the women partners in that firm and just said, I just respect you, and I just want to give you a heads up, this is what I'm doing. And she said, you should really think before you make this huge drastic change. It seems to me you're just trying to get away from this one little element that doesn't suit you, and you're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. You're talking about going from this private business practice to in-house government work. You may be going from the frying pan to the kettle on this one. Why don't you try what I do? So in some ways you might say, well, that's really unusual, that'll never happen. You never know. If you really are determined to make a change and you just start exploring all the opportunities about how that might happen, you don't know. So I think it's not so much anticipating, okay, there's got to be a way that I can identify that this is going to happen perfectly, because there's probably not going to be. I mean, maybe there will be, you'll be real lucky, but unless you kind of first take the step in your own mind that I'm willing to take whatever risks might be out there to get out there and find something that's better suited to me.
So what happened?
So I started, we went to the chairman of the firm and said, we really want to do this, and you have to do some of the political schmoozing, and said, oh, this is a great opportunity for the firm. She's done this employment business law, and there's a crossover with business immigration law. It's a great marketing opportunity, yada, yada, yada. It was true, but, not necessarily the driving force between our decision together. So the firm agreed, and that's what I started doing. And eventually she and I left, started our own firm that we have now.
What made you decide to, we've talked to other people about large firms versus small firms, and what made you decide to go? I mean, I assume your first firm was the firm you were at was large, and now you're small. Right, smaller.
Yes.
Maybe could you talk about why and what's the differences?
The driving force was the ability to sort of meet our clients' needs more efficiently, faster. We have a lot of high-tech clients, and I think when you're in a niche sort of practice like we have, very focused, very boutique firm, people call it, that sometimes it's difficult to do the best job you can for your clients in a big firm structure. I don't think saying anything negative about the big firms per se. It's just that they have a lot of needs to attend to, and it's sort of the greater good mentality, and it may not be what's best for you or your clients. So you just kind of have to weigh, because you're going to give some things up. I mean, it's very scary. You're out there, you sign personal guarantees for leases, your house, your savings is on the line, so you have to have a certain amount of willingness to just sort of jump off the cliff. It's interesting, if anyone had ever told me I'd be on my own or, in a small firm, never in a million years. Because when I started, I thought, I like being able to, do my sort of intellectual thing with this security blanket around me, so that there's, other than being personally miserable, there's no real problems with it. And so it's really been interesting. What I turned out to have just loved about it is the immediacy of it. That you make it, there's two parts to it. One is obviously serving the clients, and the other is sort of your internal administrative day-to-day workings of the firm and what you have to do with. In terms of the clients, it's frankly, I think, nice to not to have to cross-sell. Big firms are big on, oh great, the employment department got, this big client, now we'll try to sell them, trust and estates, or we'll try to do their tort litigation or whatever it might be. And I don't like that. It's curious, I'm starting out in a big firm, this is in the mid-'80s, where a lot of discussions about, the senior partners would come down and have lunch with you and tell you how to market. I think most of us sat around that table going, I didn't go to law school to be a salesman. And it seemed very superficial. And it's interesting now, obviously I care a lot about getting business. That's, how we pay our bills and what we do, but it's much different. It's about wanting to do a good job for my client, and it's about being very intimately and closely connected to that client and their business, and being partners with that client. I feel much more that way in this environment than in a big firm. It was sort of like, just sort of the work coming in the door, the sort of, here's a widget, make this sort of thing. Now, granted, I think that could have in large part to do with, being a young associate versus, 15 years out of practice now. 'Cause I'm sure there's, partners in the big firm that are at that level. In terms of the day-to-day administration of the firm and the work environment, that difference is even bigger. You don't have committee meetings where there's political agendas, there's all sorts of things going on. You sit down at a table and you say, well, do we want to do this? Yes, no, why not? And you do it, and that's it. We had a great year. The staff, worked to death to help us. They're part of the team. Let's give them all big bonuses. So we do that, or So that's fun. That's really fun.
Okay, so we had someone else say that you should spend like 2 to 4 years at a big firm and then go do whatever you want. Do you think that you have to do that? Do you think that because you'll get a good education there?
Mm-hmm.
But what if someone wanted just to be in a boutique environment from the beginning? Do you think that that's possible? And also, would you advise that?
Good question. My background, obviously, was I started with a big firm, and there were lots of good things about that. I mean, you got exposed to a lot of different personalities. You got exposed to a fair amount of different kinds of work. For me, I'm glad I did that, and I also think if I hadn't done that, just given where I was or my confidence level or something, there might have always been that notion, well, could I have made it in a big firm, or did I not do that because they didn't think I was good enough or something. So to me, I was glad I did that, I think. But I don't think you have to at all. I can think of, I clerked after my first year with a very small employment law boutique, and I think I could have been probably very happy, doing that kind of work for a long time without the rest. I will say, even given everything I've said about litigation, I'm glad I did some of that. Now, whether you do it in a boutique firm or a big firm, I think it's really helpful to have the experience of knowing how the whole thing can go. From advising a client to seeing either them following that advice and getting sued for it, or deciding not to follow it, and seeing what happens ultimately. I think it's very helpful to have that whole spectrum kind of under your belt. And it helps you make much better decisions when you decide, okay, I don't like that end of it, I like this front end of it, and that's what I'm going to do. But at least and your advice is in the context of knowing all of that, because otherwise I think you're probably a little bit limited.
All right, this is a harder question, but I think sometimes it doesn't get asked. I think more politically, people at big firms have a tendency to do really well at law school, and that they're the elite. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is not make it just about the elite of Arizona. And the question is, what happens if you can't get to? I mean, and also, if you don't do as well in law school, does that mean that you're not going to be very good at the profession?
Absolutely not. And let me just start with an analogy to that, I think. Law school, your first year, your grades in your first semester determine whether you get onto law review, basically, right? And they also determine whether you get the interviews. You've been through a half a year of law school, and that determines the interviews you get in the fall of your second year, pretty much. Maybe some spring people, but that determines that. And that's, the people that get hired by the big firms pretty much, and there's a huge disconnect between that first,
Okay.
Do it again. Okay.
So if you're not, so what happens?
Okay, so I was explaining, my analogy was remembering law school. I was one of those people, I did very well my first year and made law review, but I had a study partner who didn't do that well the first year. But by the third year, by the time we graduated, she had a better grade point average than I did. And I think the same holds true for practice. I mean, people find their strides at different times and in different ways. And I can think of the class, just so everyone doesn't think it happens only one way, I can remember that class that clerked at this firm in Phoenix. It was a big firm, it was all the stars. Some of those people now, they got like some hole in the wall office in, Texas doing, contract dispute work for some hotel or something. So it goes the other way. It's just no one talks about those stories. It's like the .com thing. No one talked about the people that lost money when it was all going gangbusters. There's just as many of those stories. And I think absolutely there's just as many stories of people who, it took them a while to hit their stride or figure out what they wanted to do, or perhaps, what they did best didn't fit into a law school blue book answer, and some of those people have gone on to do tremendously well, whether you say financially, I don't know, but I'm quite sure there's several of those, but just in terms of career satisfaction, which is ultimately, I think, what it's all about.
What about that money stuff? That comes up a lot.
Stuff.
The sort of expectations of what your life is supposed to be like financially as a lawyer, and also what sacrifices you make for that. But also, like, what should students? How much money do you need to live? Do you know what I mean? Like, and how much focus should you put?
It's a much bigger question than law students in law school. I think we all struggle with that a little bit. when I consider myself fortunate in that when I entered law school, I really, I think a couple of people in my family had been to college. No one had been a lawyer. No one had done great things, either financially or otherwise particularly. And I was lucky enough, frankly, to just sort of stumble into it in some ways. And when I went to law school, honestly, I thought, if I could just make, this is 20 years ago, $20,000 to $30,000 a year for the rest of my life, as long as I knew I could make that much and have interesting work and still be able to work when I'm 60 compared to, being a waitress or something and not being able to do it because of physical problems or mental problems or something. That's all I wanted. I've been fortunate that it's exceeded that, but it's never been about that for me. On the other hand, I don't think that people should think money's evil either. There's lots of people that make a whole lot of money for doing a whole lot less of value or hard work than lawyers do. So I think you just kind of have to find your own comfort zone with that. I don't think you want to be in a position where you've gotten yourself so in debt and you're spending, 10 years of your life, paying off that debt and worrying about that more than you're able to focus on your career, your family, your friends, your life. Some people are lucky and Zen masters or something, and it doesn't bother them. But I think for most people, if you're in debt, you're sort of, losing sleep over it, and you're not able to focus on the other stuff. So some balance there. It's easy to get caught up in because that's, it's like the carrot on the stick. I think both for people who entered law school with a family background or an experience of sort of taking that for granted or being entitled to it, they really feel awful if they don't go after that. And for the rest of us who maybe didn't have that experience, it's like something you never had. So it is sort of the carrot on the stick that, wow, I have an opportunity to have these creature comforts I never had before. It's hard.
Interesting. All right, a couple of other sort of, when you teach at ASU, sort of your adjunct hat, sort of what do you think the role of an adjunct is as opposed to practicing and the faculty, being a full-time faculty member? And what are your thoughts about the sort of adjunct world?
I think the adjuncts owe it to the law school and to the academic environment not to be in there just sort of telling war stories. There's a place for that in terms of, in law school, there's obviously a place for real academic rigor, and there's a place for residency, whether it's through the clinic program or whatever else. But I don't think either of them should be completely separate from the other. I think they should be really integrated to the extent you can, because I think that raises the actual practice of law to a higher level, and I also think it raises the teaching to a higher level. So I try to sprinkle it with a fair amount of, okay, this is what happens in real life, and these are the situations that arise, and how do you kind of apply the law to that. But I think the danger of being in there just telling war stories and kind of, hi, I'm a real lawyer, this is what I do every day. The danger of that is just as great as a professor who's never been outside of the four walls, for 50 years, teaching. I can't even remember the name of it now. Remember the first year tort class you had, falling off the chair, and they teach that every year, all year long, and what are they really adding here? So I think the dangers in both are pretty equal.
What about the notion of getting, we'll jump around a bunch.
Sure.
What about the notion of getting business now that you, both in a big firm and your own firm now that's smaller? Yeah. What kind of role does that play in your thoughts about that?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if it's a result of being in a small firm, although I think that obviously has a lot to do with it, or just getting more mature in the practice. But I really enjoy it, and it's usually not about, I remember one senior partner talking about, well, the thing you do is when you go to like a social gathering, you stand in line in the buffet line behind somebody and, kind of bring up what you do, or, it's just so awkward. My version of it is you just try to do a really good job for the clients that you have, and you form very human relationships with them. We haven't really talked about the role of being a woman lawyer, which is maybe less significant these
No,
days.
that's-
You know, I'm not.
That's one of the topics.
It was
we're
not.
gonna get to.
It's never been as significant for me, you know, because I went to law school in the early '80s. So I think, you know, the generation that went in the '70s, that was huge. But I think it's still somewhat an issue because there's still lots of large firms that are the culture is very male, and that's not bad. It's just different. And I will tell you that I bet almost all, 80% of our major clients, my contact person inside is a woman about my age. And that makes a tremendous difference. It's also the flip side, lest we be critical of the good old boys playing golf and doing what they did. It's the flip side of the same thing. I mean, we have things in common. We have ways of relating without even trying that build relationships with those people. I mean, it's not, you know, in large part, it's not about getting business. It's, you know, about, oh, I really like this person and they happen to be doing this job in this company, or, you know, you run into them in some other context, or, you know, they know somebody with somebody else and they refer you to. But you've honestly, in the case of really good client relationships, you've built a relationship with another human being. And, you know, the truth is it's much easier if you have things in common that don't take a whole lot of work. I mean, that's not to say I don't have clients that are men or that, you know, it's purely sort of business relationship. But I think a lot of what the guys had access to, we now have more access to, in terms of, you know, there's people out there like us.
Mm-hmm.
There's people that you go shopping with, or that you go hiking with, or that, you know, you do all that stuff without having to kind of separate it. So.
Do you have other thoughts about women, sort of the place of women in law at this point? All kinds of things come up, and we're trying to not just ask these questions of women. And not just,
what do the men say?
Well, sometimes they are, they pause and they're a bit confused, but sometimes they have answers to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes they do. There's a long pause.
Yeah.
But sort of, I guess the question is sort of what should law look like? I guess, I mean, maybe this is my own personal philosophy, and that shouldn't be in here, but
we'll edit it out.
Yeah, it seems like the question of women in law should not be women in law, but people in law and families, and not family in the sense of like you have kids, but your relationship with the world. And yeah. I don't know if that's being addressed, or if it's changing, or if you have thoughts about sort of how do you operate within this whole sphere.
Well, I agree with you. And in fact, our firm, we have 2 women partners and 4 women associates, and about 35 legal assistants, only about 2 of which are men. I think in a firm of 50 people, we have less than 5 men. So if you were to ask me, the question would be, so what would you think about a man in your law firm? No, you know, we like them just fine, but it's, I won't say it's not work, but it leads to your point, which is, you know what, it's just people are different. And gender is one of those differences that tends to bring, in most cases, you know, certain things with it, certain ways we think, certain ways we're used to doing things, and that's not a bad thing. It's just sort of means you have to think about things differently, or it's not as easy sometimes. But I agree with you. I think it's, you know, it's not just gender. It's a whole lot of things that if you want to expand this to you know, be more inclusive, you've got to be more open to all sorts of different people that don't exactly match your comfort zone. I think in terms of family, whether it be children, you know, significant others, parents, you know, there's more and more it's parents. I mean, I think your generation is maybe my stereotype, but I think more and more many of the men feel exactly, you know, the way you do. People are just generally interested in more balance, which is just, I think it's critical. At the same time, some people, young lawyers that I've talked to, they seem to think that more balance means more balance every single day. And that's not the way it works. You've chosen a career that's demanding, no matter what part of it, no matter what different aspect of law you choose to practice. And there's going to be times where, you know, you're not going to get home till very late. And there's going to be times when something has to give, whether it be your family, your friendships, or sometimes your work for your family. And that's not going to go away, and I think it's really unrealistic for people to expect that. You know, after 15 years, and I have to say, for me, I don't think too many sacrifices. There are more balanced days now than there are not, But I'm very cognizant of the fact that when I was a young lawyer, I mean, especially the first few years, you really poured yourself into it. Now, I think that raises a real dilemma in terms of having children and child raising, because that's the timing is just all wrong there. But I think people find ways to deal with that or find situations that work for them in that respect.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
Find ways to deal?
Well, I talked to someone else that happened to be a young male, but he said when he really we talked about this, and after a while, he basically said that if you wanted to be somewhere that was really exciting or he wasn't in a big firm, but he was somewhere that was very demanding, that you basically really couldn't have children until after 4 years, and that if you had children, that you should probably just go to some other simpler space. And it seems like, is that really the case, or are there sort of ways to, I mean, it seems like there's an emphasis on hours as opposed to quality. I don't know if that's just the nature of the practice, or...
A couple things. First, in the interest of full disclosure, I don't have children, but that was a decision that was unrelated to my law practice. I mean, it was made a long time ago for other reasons. So I will say I've probably had that luxury, but I've had other emotional demands, other relationships that needed to be sustained. But I don't think anyone would be honest if they didn't say children were. I mean, relationships with other adults, you can, discuss, you can compromise, you can negotiate. Children are like, that's it. I mean, but I think that speaks to this is really big life stuff.
Right.
But you've got to make choices. To expect that you're not going to have to make choices. Or that somehow you're entitled to have it all. I mean, it's the oldest line in the book these days, but it's not going to happen. At least not in that way, not all at once. So, I don't know. I've often thought if I had small children, I think, knowing my personality, I think I would have been tempted to be with them kind of full time. But, my partner, for example, did it entirely differently. She had small children in the late 70s, early 80s, they're in their early 20s now, worked at big firms, kind of did a lot of stuff. And let me tell you, the kids are delightful, they're happy, they're well adjusted. She did have a spouse that didn't have as demanding a job as she did. I mean, I think that's another thing that you have to factor in. Again, it's not just this one-on-one, me and my law firm, me and my spouse, me and my kids, whatever. I mean, it's a whole circle of things you kind of have to factor in. And okay, what do I want? What different parts of this can I balance to kind of get me where I want to get? I think you're right though about hours, and it's another thing I love about what I do. I work longer hours, but we don't do any billable hours. The nature of the practice that we have is that we can do fixed fees, and so to me, it's so much more honest. But I don't know, with all due respect, I don't know that that's possible in litigation, because sometimes a case takes longer than others, but basically we kind of know. I think litigation's much more unpredictable, but that is, it's all about efficiency. It's like, it's kind of a business model rather than a legal model, if you want to acknowledge a difference, which is we have sort of a product or a service we're providing, and we're going to charge X for it, and obviously we're more profitable if we can do that with less time, but still a very good result. And to me, that's the way it should be, but I don't know if it's not possible in litigation, or I tend to think people just haven't spent enough time thinking about how to do that. So that, rewards, again, the family and friendship obligations, if it's about quality and product. We have a young lawyer with 2 small children, and she always goes home at 5:30. Now, I think transactional practice, you can do that, generally speaking, more than litigation, but sometimes she works from home in the evening. A couple of young lawyers have pretty much made a commitment not to work on the weekends. My thought is they need to be a little bit less rigid about that, not saying they should be there, but I know, there's times when sometimes that's your 3 or 4 hours of quiet time when the phone's not ringing, and, you want to develop your practice and do a good job for your clients. Sometimes you need that time, so.
I have a couple more questions. You mentioned something about business versus legal model, and there's sort of, it's very interesting, and you do it very positively, which is good. Can you talk more about that? Because sometimes people act like if law is business, that it's somehow a negative.
Yeah, and I couldn't disagree more. And I haven't thought a lot about this. It's a good question. I mean, why do people think it's a negative? And I think it probably has to do with the notion that a business, you're just trying to sell something and make money, and you're not really concerned with your ethical obligation to do the right thing for your client. And there's this notion of profession versus business, and that somehow the word profession suggests a much nobler calling. I think there are plenty of business people. I'm not suggesting that by calling lawyers business people that somehow lowers the bar. I think there are lots of business people, maybe not used car salesmen, but lots of business people who care very much about how their clients do. I think it was at the Board of Visitors meeting, someone was speaking about it's your tax.
Yes.
She was talking about the big interdisciplinary practice mode, and a couple people that were in the room said they had gone to conferences where there were meetings of like these accountants and the lawyers, and the accountants were really just as suspicious of us. Like, who are these people? They don't care about what's they're just lawyers or shysters or whatever they think of us. So I'm not suggesting that we go down to the lowest common denominator of what business is about, but I think it's a mistake to suggest that business denotes something bad. I mean, again, I think you find business people who care very much about the people that they sell their products and services to. So.
All right, here's another one. You talked about client relationships, and I thought maybe you could, maybe you can't. You don't have to answer any of these questions. Sort of for people who haven't ever really been around clients, the difference between maybe a client relationship versus friends versus like a family member or relatives, like sort of give them a sense of what that is and sort of how that develops, that kind of thing.
Trying to pause for a moment because I want to remember back when I was a young lawyer and first introduced to clients and versus where it's gone now. When I was a young lawyer, I think the main thing is initially to be respectful and to maintain, a professional business stance, but also, to have enough confidence in yourself and enough, that's maybe an oxymoron right out of law school, but, and just enough confidence in yourself as a human being to realize it's just another human being. I mean, and to the extent you're a well-behaved, educated, polite person, that's kind of all you have to be. I mean, there's not a lot of razzle-dazzle around it. I mean, you just behave yourself and treat the person like you would want to be treated, that sort of thing, without getting too close. I think as you get farther along and you're more able to sort of draw the distinction between friendships that might develop in the course of a client relationship, I mean, it's very easy. I'm thinking of one in-house woman client in particular. I mean, I think if we didn't work together, we would probably end up being great friends. And we have that little part of it that's great friends. But for both of us, it's not really a problem at all to know where the business decisions and business strategy and things like that begin and end, and not to ever take advantage of the friendship in terms of the client relationship. And I think that just may take some practice, but initially it's just being a decent, respectful person, but being able to enjoy, the other person as a person too.
Okay, a little bit of a twist on this. What about clients that are your friends or that are your relatives? Don't do it, or do it, or is it different rules?
I wouldn't. And that's just my personal thing, and it's purely a practical answer, I think, not so much ethical, although I tend to think there may be ethical considerations there. But for me, I know things can go wrong. You can do the best job in the world, and if it's in litigation, you could lose a case. If it's in transactional practice like I do, there might be delays by the INS. People get frustrated. I would prefer not to have that layer of difficulty on. And I'll pose something back to you. I mean, you spent some time talking about balancing, family and friends and relationships with your work. Well, I mean, that's enough work. Why do you want to muck that? At least you have, if you've worked a little bit hard to maintain a decent personal life, why do you want to take this side of it and throw it all over that so you have no place to go for some, exit or, time away from all of that? So that's just, my personal, I'm sure people do it and it works very well because they know each other. Maybe they have, unspoken ways of communicating, whatever it may be. But for me, I kind of try to stay away from that.
I'd like to spend a little bit of time on your business immigration stuff, since we have an immigration law clinic here, and there's a lot of students who are interested in that kind of stuff. I wanted to sort of ask, what kind of opportunities do you see for students who like that stuff? We can just start with that question.
I think there's a lot, and there's a lot of, this was surprising to me when I began to explore this area and then make the actual shift. I mean, I think you look back 20 or 30 years ago, I don't know if you've interviewed anybody from that time, but I mean, people did everything. I mean, they did trust and estates, they represented you in litigation, you know, they represented your business or the person or whatever, and it's increasingly gotten more and more specialized. And when I went from doing employment law, I would have never guessed there was, there's business immigration, there's family immigration, and that you really, I mean, you can do both, but I think you can easily just choose one avenue. So with that said, I mean, there's many areas within immigration law. There's the business aspect. There's, if you were interested in employment too, I know, several in-house folks that handle kind of all of that, human relations, personnel issues, immigration, employment. There's opportunities to work, at INS or in government kind of policy making. There's the opportunities that the people that are working in the clinic now, hands-on, just work with individual cases, individual people who really need your help. So I think there's a whole lot of opportunity.
What happens when you're dealing with the employers or the employees, and you said there's a difference between business and family? It seems like there would be situations where those would merge.
There are. Sometimes. Sometimes that means we have to tell the individual employee, you need your own lawyer. I mean, some ethical issues come up. Just one example is the business immigration part of it. The way the person gets their permanent residency is based on their job. And sometimes they might go off and become married to a U.S. citizen. Well, they could also obtain their permanent residency that way. Well, if they decide to do that, then they're not tied to that employer anymore. So we're sort of in the position of saying, you can choose, but you really need to get your own lawyer for this part of it, because otherwise we're put in the interesting ethical position if they come to us and say, okay, now I'm married to a U.S. citizen and I have this employment authorization document while my case is pending. It means I can go work anywhere, right? Yeah, right. Well, what if the employer didn't want to lose that person? So there's some natural divisions in that way. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you another question. This is a little more political. You don't have to answer if you don't want. What about this notion of all the whole things? I worked for a sexual orientation professor who did a lot of research on all this stuff, and that was one of my jobs here. What about what about the notion that the whole same-sex marriage or domestic partner relationships and immigration, and how do you deal with that? I mean, do you get into situations like that where one person wants to come over, but then how do they get their partner over, and how do you deal with that?
I actually just recently had a case sort of like that. It was a gentleman that wanted to stay here who was running out of his temporary visa time, and his employer hadn't taken the necessary steps to get him to where he needed to be to remain here past that time. And his driving force in wanting to remain here was that his partner was here working and was a U.S. citizen. So we went to great lengths. And the company, he was very important to the company. And again, there's probably in the purely personal context, if he had just come to me, off the street and talked to me, I might not have been able to do as much as we were able to do, which was working with his employer and a past employer, do a great deal of strategizing and creative maneuvering. I mean, I won't go into the detail. You'd have to know a whole lot about immigration law,
right.
But he's still here legally, and we were able to work with different things we could sort of take advantage of. Now, granted, it's not tied to his relationship to this U.S. citizen, but we were able to accomplish sustaining that relationship, I guess you'd say, through a variety of other means, which is, that's real lawyering too. That's kind of what's fun, is helping kind of a bigger issue, both in terms of the company needing his talents and his personal life through legal maneuvering, if you will.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And that was, on the other hand, here's where balance comes in. I'll just kind of loop this in. This all came to a head, I think it was early part of December. No one had really been tracking this. I can remember sitting in like the Target parking lot on my cell phone on a Saturday morning at like 8 o'clock, calling like 3 or 4 different people, the Saturday before Christmas, trying to get all the pieces in place and get all the right people to agree to stuff. So, I mean, again, just to sort of, I feel very grateful that my schedule is as flexible as it is. In that way, it's very much unlike litigation. Someone delivers, now I'm jumping around, but the differences to me in this way are very satisfying. Litigation, someone can deliver a response to a motion for summary judgment, and this happens. They purposely hand deliver it on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, because under the Civil Rules of Procedure, then you don't have mailing time, and then you only have X number of days to respond. And I mean, yeah, you can request postponements, maybe if there's, a decent person on the other side, but sometimes not. Sometimes their attitude is, you know what, my job is to protect my client. And I think you talk in law school a lot about this, your obligation to the justice system and, the profession versus your obligation to your client. And those are tough, real calls, and some people take the standpoint that whatever I can do to screw you is good for my client. Anyway, that said, I don't have that. I mean, I'm very, very busy, and there's times where, I thought I was going to go Christmas shopping, or, if I had a child, I was going to do this, and you know what, I can't. I've got to be on the phone. But there's other times I can plan, I'm going to take a 3-day weekend or long weekend, and I know I can do that, and I know maybe I have to make a few calls or log in and check emails, but I can work around that. But I think you got to be willing to do that. You can't be so rigid that, like, this is my time, this is my family time, this is whatever,
All right, another question, and I know we're running out of time. What happens when because, even though your clients it's not criminal law and they're not going to be executed if but they will be deported or something like that, and how do you deal with it when it doesn't work?
Fortunately, I haven't had anybody deported yet, but I have had, remember this is kind of another one of your questions, what clients wouldn't you take or what things have gone by. This again is sort of another general life thing, I guess, and maybe that speaks well to the practice of law. I still battle with taking things personally and focusing on sort of worrying about it instead of what can be done. And the more I'm in practice, the better job I do of that, which is, this is the situation. How can we problem solve this? What can we do about this? And just start working at it. And when you do everything you can and you get to the point where it's still not what you want, you just kind of got to let it go. That's, I think, very hard, and almost the more conscientious you are. But I think the thing you have to learn is, worrying and fretting and being anxious about something doesn't change the result. What changes the result is, okay, to the extent it's helpful to put all that emotional stuff out of the way and work on the problem. This sounds really silly, but I think of the astronaut scene in a couple of those movies, work the problem. And that to me is, in some ways, it's been, I think, not only wonderful, liberating personally, but also makes me a much better lawyer. Because all that other stuff doesn't help you do a better job for your client. It doesn't help you reach a better result.
And how do you tell your client, how do you break the news to them?
Very straightforward. And again, sort of without, to the extent you can, conveying somehow that, if only I'd done a better job, if only I'd been a better lawyer. It's going to be interesting for you. You have to sort of work that out yourself, but the best way to do it is just to say, is to make that peace with yourself first, that, I did everything I could, and I thought through everything, and, sometimes you didn't, honestly, and I know lawyers, I think any lawyer, but I personally know lots of lawyers with, 30 years of experience that happens, and, they're, the best lawyers are very, very good at saying, what, I did everything I was capable of at that time. Looking in hindsight, might I have done something different, but that doesn't help. That doesn't help anything. So, and the good news is, in my experience, again, a lot of this has been watching older, more experienced, good lawyers, in my opinion, is they just keep moving it forward. They're and when they do that, the chances of having that conversation where you have to say to your client, this awful thing I've caused has happened, are very few, because you find solutions that you wouldn't find if you're sitting around berating yourself.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
That's very good. I like that.
It works.